Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's daily chess test, I have two very interesting and very instructive exercises. One of them is of a very positional nature, well, maybe strategic, but more so positional. And the other one is pure calculation, but you have to be imaginative to figure it out. Okay, let's start with the first position. This is Karpov-Lerner from 1993, played in the USSR Championship. It's black to play. Take your time. I mean, for this one, you need to ask yourself the correct questions. It's not about lines, it's about figuring out what's going on and what you would like to achieve and what the key features of the position are. Okay, pause the video. Good luck, see you in a minute. Okay, the first question that should come to your mind, of course, in any position is who is better and why. Here, it's obvious that white has an extra pawn. But the pawn in itself is not such a big deal. It's about where that pawn is. And this pawn on h4 changes the nature of the position significantly. If you put that pawn on b2 or a3 or a2, c4, I don't know, the position would be way different because white wouldn't have as many attacking chances as he does now. Also, if black had a pawn on h5, the position would again be much calmer. With the ability to play h5, white is given a very strong attacking option, which black can do nothing about. Black cannot prevent h5. What black can do is he can try and prevent the incoming attack from being too powerful. So that's the first thing. White is better because he has a pawn up and because he has great practical chances. Now, okay, the second question, and the more obvious question in this position, which is the first question that should come to your mind, is should black trade rooks or not? Because you have been offered the rook trade. Karpov played rook to d2. And now, well, trading rooks is a key decision here. If you make a mistake, you could lose. Okay, so the white king is in the center. The black queen seems nicely centralized on f5 and has influence on a lot of squares. So your first idea, and probably what most people would think of, is, well, I want to keep the rooks on the board because I increase my winning chances. Maybe I can infiltrate somehow. And yeah, definitely I'm pawn down, I shouldn't be trading, blah, blah, blah. However, if you don't trade rooks, what you have to consider is the fact that white has his rook on the board as well. So this move by Karpov is actually a stroke of positional genius. And what he did with this move is he gave black an option to go badly wrong and to go for a very tempting idea of keeping the rooks on the board and trying to attack because he is a pawn down. So what Karpov did with the move rook to d2 is he said, okay, if you trade the rooks, I'm a pawn up in the endgame. If you don't trade the rooks, I'm going to beat you. And Mr. Lerner made a mistake here. So he declined the rook trade with rook to e8. This is a really bad mistake because now Karpov can play rook to g2 and h5 is coming. And after h5 comes, well, you're basically in trouble. Lerner tried queen to d7 stuff, but h5 came and he resigned a few moves later. I don't want to go into this attack. You can find the whole game online. It's available. Maybe instead of queen to d7, the move king g7 was better, and now Karpov wouldn't have anything better but to go for a queen trade. And now this is a rook endgame in which white is a pawn up, obviously, but maybe it's not enough to win. With extremely precise play from black would hold. Again, I analyzed this endgame extensively. I didn't manage to win with white. Here was my best idea. f5 and now f6. But even so, I don't think this is enough for white to win because the pawn on h4 is extremely weak and the rook is sort of tied down. And you don't really have time to get your king in to defend the pawn because then the e5 pawn falls. Nazari. Okay, so let's move on. Another way to decline the rook trade, which is also bad, is rook to a8, which was my first idea when I analyzed this position. Now here, white shouldn't really go rook to g2, because now black has a ton of counterplay with something like rook to a1, and if h5, then rook h1. And this is again pretty good. But after rook a8, white can simply play rook to h2, preventing this rook a1, rook h1 idea, and again should be much better. So coming back to the starting position, the correct decision here, and I said in the introduction that it wasn't about calculation, the correct decision was to actually trade rooks, which may seem hard to understand. It was really hard to understand for me. But when you look at all the other options, I mean, it is the most logical decision to make. So you take, white takes, and now you keep centralizing, queen e4. Your queen comes into play. White offers a queen trade. Obviously, the pawn endgame is going to be winning for white. So you have to decline. So you can play queen h1, for example. Pressure on h4. Excellent drawing chances because, well, all queen endgames tend to be drawn even though one side is a pawn up because there's just too much counterplay. The second thing is the white pawns are pretty weak. f4 is weak, h4 is weak, c2 is weak. Your pawns, on the other hand, are pretty compact. b7 is the only weakness, and also the white king is in the center. So the engine gives this as 0, 0, 0, 0. Of course, a human would prefer to be white here, but again, not easy to win. Probably not possible to win if black plays correctly. Okay, let's move on to the second position. This is a study by a very old Palbenko, composed in 2001. I mean, lately I've been just fascinated with Palbenko's studies. They're really nice. And this one he composed when he was, I don't know how old. How old was Palbenko in 2001? Probably 80. Okay, so it's white to play. Again, this, unlike the first position, is going to require precise ideas and precise calculation. Again, take your time. The rules are on the screen. Solve it over real board. Good luck. Pause the video and see you in a minute. Okay. Okay. Let's look at the key features again. Well, black has 3 pawns. Obviously, this is the most threatening one. The other 2 are really not that dangerous yet. And if this pawn is traded for the rook, if black manages to do that, then it's a draw. Because because the white king is in time to take both pawns, and white, it's just going to be a draw. Black cannot queen any of the pawns, so black has nothing better. Okay, so white knows that he has a draw at least. So you try to find a variation for white. The first thing that you should have said to yourself is, okay, fine, I'm not losing. Because worst case scenario, I can play rook a6, rook takes a3, and then king d5, king takes d6, king takes d7, agree to a draw. So you're trying to win. The second thing that we have to factor in is, of course, that the rook is attacked. So normal moves like king to b3 check fail to d takes c6. So you cannot move your king, have to move your rook. Okay, now let's look at some bad options, and then we will look at the 2 most sensible options. Hopefully you found one of the good options, well, the only good option. The other option that seems good fails to a very specific reason, which hopefully you understood. We will get to that. Okay, the first thing is, if you play rook to a6, then king to b2, and it's a clear draw. There's nothing you can do to prevent a2, a1, and you are going to have to take with the rook. If, for example, king d5, then a2, and now you simply have to start checking. Rook b6, king c2, rook a6, king b2, and it's a draw. So rook a6 doesn't work. The same goes for rook d6. It's absolutely the same. a2, rook a6, and now again, this is just the best you have. There's nothing better to do. So you cannot take the pawn, you cannot play rook a6. Now, there are only 2 more options. Okay, yeah, you can play rook to b6, which doesn't work either. I just play a2, and again, you have to go back to a6, and again, I play king b2, you play rook b6, I play king c2, etc., etc., etc. So the 2 sensible options are rook to c7 and rook to c8. Now, I'm going to show you the correct move first, and then I'll try to explain why the other move is bad. The correct move is rook to c8. Okay. The idea behind this move is you are given the option to transfer your rook to this side of the board and check from the side. And you're going to see why that's important. Let's look at some variations. The best move for black is actually king to b2. If black tries a2, then you can play king b3 check, and after king to b1, you can play rook h8 or rook g8 or rook f8, doesn't really matter. Any of these moves work, because now if a1 equals queen, that's checkmate. If a1 equals knight, you don't really care about that, just king c3, and again, this knight is completely trapped. If knight c2, rook h1 check, and then you win. Let's just briefly have a look at the variation if white blunders with rook to c7. That's the other move that seems sensible. Now, if a2, and you play king b3 check, and he plays king b1, you have nothing better but rook a7. He's threatening to queen, because you cannot check on c1. You wish you could play rook h8 here, or rook g8, or rook f8, but you cannot. So now it's a draw, because after rook a7, I just queen, and takes, and yeah, draw. Okay, so coming back to the correct move, rook c8 to keep this option of rook h8 and rook h1 and check, or rook g8, rook g1 and check. Now, so we saw a2. a2 doesn't work. What if black plays king to b2? That's way more resilient. Now, we have to get this king out of the way. So we check first. This is very important. Rook b8 check. Why do we do this? Because if he goes to a2, then it's simply winning. You just go king c3 and you're going to mate him. Eventually, he's going to have to start moving his d pawn and then you win. For example, like this. That's it. Eventually, he's going to have to move all the pawns. So after rook b8 check, he can only go to c1 or to c2. Let's say king c2 is the same thing. And now you transfer your rook to h8. This is wonderful. So now if a2, then rook to h2 check. If king b1, you again play king b3. We saw this position already. If a1 equals knight, simply king to, sorry, not equals queen, that's checkmate. If a1 equals knight, then you move your king away to c3. And again, there's nothing he can do. If knight c2, then check here. Yeah. So against rook h8, maybe d5 can be tried, but you don't take this. If you play king takes d5, you actually draw the game, because a2 and rook h2 and king b1, and you don't have king b3. You cannot jump over two squares. So it's actually a draw. So you have to repeat with rook h1, rook h2. But after d5, you can simply play king to b4, and it's the same thing. a2, rook h2, king b1, king b3, or king a3. Even if he queens with check, you don't really care. Here and king b3. And again, if he moves the queen, it's checkmate. If he moves the king, you win the queen. It's game over. So this very important nuance of being able to go around the position here, I think was very beautiful. And this study wasn't too hard, but I think it's very instructive, because it should teach you how to think in a complex endgame, which seems simple. It's very easy to lose points in positions like this one. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hope you got something from the two positions today. Let me know what you think about them. Yeah, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye-bye.